This chapter begins with a discussion of 3 cases that became national news. And as a result, it prompted a public outcry and a debate regarding the best response to national terrorism. National terrorism, as you may know, involves attacks on U.S. soil by individuals legally in the country. So they could be citizens, they could be refugees, they could be lawful permanent residents, for example. But they also have ties or connections to terrorist countries and the groups in those countries, or they have radical beliefs or extreme views that are prompted from terrorist propaganda. Those examples, real quick, I'm not going to go into the stories. You can read those on your own, first couple pages, page and a half. The bombing, the Boston Marathon, you might be even very familiar with these because they've been in the news. Bombing at the Boston Marathon, the shooting rampage at the San Bernardino County Public Health Department, that was in the news all over television when it happened. There was an individual who drove his vehicle into a bunch of pedestrians at Ohio State University, and then he proceeded to get out of the car and began stabbing people. And of course, when these hit the news, questions of, how are we going to handle these? And, the president is making sweeping executive orders, resulting in people who are undocumented, they don't have papers that they're showing they're legally here in the country, that they're subject to deportation. There was the ban on prohibiting citizens of these 7 Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries, from coming to the U.S. And ultimately, those executive orders made their way through the court system and up to the Supreme Court, and they were deemed unconstitutional. But the bigger question becomes, what motivates these people to do these things? What's the real motive? Was the crime a matter of choice, a rational choice? Did they make a decision, or is it an outcome of delusional thinking and maybe mental illness? And that's where criminology comes. All right, so what is criminology? It's right there on the screen, right? An academic discipline that uses the scientific method to study the nature, extent, cause, and control of criminal behavior. And how they do this, or where this comes from, it involves several different disciplines, academic disciplines. It can come from criminal justice, study of criminal justice, psychology, sociology, legal studies, criminal law falls in here. So this chapter is going to focus on what is criminology, what do criminologists do, what is the history of criminology, how do criminologists define crime, how do they understand criminal law, and the difference between criminology and criminal justice. And of course, we'll talk about the ethical issues that criminologists face as well. So what do they do? Well, they have a few things that they do. These are the areas that the areas in the field that they study. So criminal statistics, criminal measurements. They create the valid and reliable measures of criminal behavior. Why would they want to do that? Why would they want to do that? Maybe so they can get answers to questions like how much crime occurs annually, who commits them, meaning like gender, age, etc. When and where does crime occur? Cities versus the suburbs, nighttime versus daytime, private areas versus public areas, and which crimes are the most serious or commonly occurring. So what do? These folks who are studying this field of study, surveys, right? They're creating ways to collect and analyze data. So it can include data education, some of the, occupation, social background, family background. That's what these surveys that they develop and create. And they design methods to make it possible to investigate the cause of crime. So that's one, studying crime measurement and statistics. Another area of study, sociology. Some criminologists study sociology. And what are they concerned with? The social, political, and intellectual influences of law and legal activity. Primary focus, investigating the role that social forces play in shaping criminal law. Investigate the role of criminal law in shaping society. They investigate history of legal thought, and they suggest legal changes to benefit society. They do that very often. You'll see a lot of criminologists' works, their studies and work in in legal briefs to our Supreme Court and high courts in trying to get laws deemed unconstitutional. Also, you see their work being submitted to legislators in trying to get laws passed or not passed based on their studies. In evaluating laws and suggesting changes, the book gives you an example about Megan's Law. That's the Sex Offender Registration Act. The law that required, and the book tells you the circumstances of the case, of how it came about. I'll let you review that. I want to talk about the act itself. It requires a person convicted of a sexual offense, and a sexual offense could be an assault, a sexual assault on a child, a sexual assault on another individual. It could be they possessed child pornography. So a sex offense has a wide range of offenses that fall under its radar or its umbrella. So it requires someone convicted of one of those offenses to register with the county they reside in. And since its institution, criminologists have studied its effectiveness and found that it did not really reduce rearrest of sex offenders or decrease the arrest for such crimes. So the suggestion is it wasn't working for what it was supposed to do. In my opinion, and it's only my opinion because I'm not a criminologist, I'm just an attorney, and I've represented a lot of folks who had to register, and I've represented a lot of people who failed to register. It's also a criminal offense if they don't register. I find that it is more of a useful tool to put the public on notice because this information is available. You can go to the website, the New York State SORA website, and look up and do a search of folks who are required to register as a sex offender in their area. And it's especially useful in small communities such as Plattsburgh. But anyway, criminologists are still studying the effectiveness of that. A positive look at using sociology is the studies of law. They've helped over time. Like I said, they use studies in court. Two prominent cases, and there's tons of cases. The two prominent ones is the where they abolished, i.e. made it unconstitutional for a person who had committed a crime when they were 18 or younger to get a life without parole sentence. That turned on the fact that the ability of completely understanding the consequences of their crime at that age played a role that they shouldn't be punished with a sentence of life without the opportunity of parole. And previous to this case, the Supreme Court abolished or made it unconstitutional to sentence anyone 18 or under to the death penalty. The other case, the Gross case, involved the likelihood of wrongful convictions in death penalty cases. And there was a lot of research done that it's a lot of folks who are on death row could possibly, that the likelihood hasn't been a lot of cases, 149 cases, I think, since the 70s. I did this, I reviewed this for another class. I think the number was 149. That's a big number since the 1970s of of people who are on death row having their convictions overturned, and just 3 of them in 2020, and the year's not even halfway over yet. the likelihood of wrongful convictions in death penalty cases is very high. That was the study. And that seemed to stem from the pressures to solve those kinds of cases, because those kind of cases involve killings and such. So the field is developing theories of crime causation. Criminologists here, they focus on the individual, the person who committed the crime, and they try and make an association with it. Based, what's their decision making, psychological traits, their biological traits, any antisocial behaviors. There's a field that studies just the psychological aspect, which is the offender's personality, development, and social learning and cognition. The biological aspect deals with the biochemical, genetic and neurological links to crime and antisocial type behavior, so biological. And then the sociological, the study of the belief that people are the product, quote unquote, product of their environment. So if you grow up, for instance, in a neighborhood with poor conditions, or poor home life and poverty, and the socialization peers aren't the greatest, that you've become the product of your environment. But the aspect, as you can imagine, nailing down one true cause of crime is not an easy task, and I don't think it can ever be a common. I don't think criminologists think it ever be a common. There's like one thing. Oh, the biological aspect. That's what caused this person to do this crime. Because if you think about it, there's children who come from abusive homes and don't grow up to be criminals, right? People who live in poverty don't go out and commit crimes. And generally, most people live law-abiding citizens. So this is still obviously a field that is developing, and maybe it's not just one thing, and maybe it's a combination of things, as we will continue to talk about all semester long. Explaining criminal behavior is another area. Research on what the criminologists do is they do research on criminal types and patterns. So they're looking at violent crimes, public order type crimes, organized crimes. They've coined, over time, two different specific patterns in crimes. And this is what we kind of use now. We have the victim precipitated homicide crimes, and then we have our white-collar crimes. And as times change and we evolve, there's going to be different or expanded crimes that will need to be defined and developed. For instance, child pornography. That has existed, but when the internet made it more accessible, we needed to have crimes developed related to its accessibility and obtaining it through the cyber world. So the law had to develop. It was always illegal to have child pornography in any sort of fashion. But white collar crime is a fairly new aspect of crime than our murder and our rapes and our arson. Those all stem from early common law, and we'll talk about that coming up in a little bit. But our white collar crimes, marketplace, involve crimes in the marketplace: theft, embezzlement, fraud, restraint of trade, false advertising. We see a lot of that in the corporate world. And the penalties don't appear to be as harsh as, say, our street crimes of murder and theft and so forth. And we'll expand more on that as we go along as well. The next theory is Penology, where criminologists study prevention through correction. So they're looking at the punishments, the sanctions, and other corrections in this instance, where they're evaluating the effectiveness of crime control programs and a search for effective treatments that can maybe lower the risk of repeat offenders or repeating offenses. And they focus on things like rehabilitation and social control. rehabilitation. They're looking for more therapeutic approaches to crime prevention. For example, drug abuser, maybe then send them to jail without any sort of treatment, so when they get out, they could reoffend. They go to a treatment program, which a lot of times is more effective. They also look at control, social control, keeping offenders out of society. And they're looking at things like mandatory sentencing for certain types of crimes, usually serious crimes. And they are even looking at capital punishment. Now, capital punishment is used for the most heinous types of crimes and only for murder. Somebody cannot be sentenced to the death penalty for rape in this country. But the theory behind the social control and using capital punishment is this individual doesn't deserve to be in this society any longer. That's the theory behind it, because what they've done was so heinous. And an example that jumps to mind is probably one of the last people who have been put to death under our federal system, the last one or two, Timothy McVeigh. And if you're not familiar with his name, he was the individual and the mastermind who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City. He was sentenced to death not that long ago. Mandatory sentencing, I touched on it, I'm going to come back to it, for serious crimes. In the federal system and in the state system, if you commit a certain sort of crime, you have to go to prison for a certain period of time. Right? Murder could be life without parole. You can go in the federal system, if you traffic a certain amount of drugs, it's a mandatory sentence, and it could be your first time doing it. It could be a mandatory sentence of 5 years. So there are some crimes that require, without option, a judge to sentence somebody, and that's what these criminologists study. Do they work? Do we need them? And so forth. And then they study the victims, right? The victims play a role in the criminal process, and the victim's behavior is also a key factor in the crime. So what do they do? What do these folks do? They're developing surveys. They want to measure the nature and extent of criminal behavior. They want to know, like, calculating the costs of a crime to victims, because victims can be a subject of theft. What did it cost them? And, it's not just the loss from the theft itself. It could be the loss of time from work. It could be how it affected their home and sense of security, if it was a robbery at their house or burglarized of their house. If they were present, did they suffer any psychological effects? Was the criminal a relative? So these are things that they look for in their surveys. Calculating the risks of victimization. Like, what's the likelihood of the victim being a victim again? What kind of cases do we see where a victim can be a victim again? Domestic violence, right? Domestic violence. Gender-specific type crimes, even though domestic violence, there is no, in the law, it doesn't say the victim has to be a woman, but the studies have shown that women are mostly the victims in domestic violent cases. Actually, as a matter of fact, in New York State, there's a study, 10% of women are strangled by a domestic partner. And as a result of this study on victims, women, New York State passed a felony-specific crime for strangulation. Technically, strangulation, choking somebody, could fall under a serious assault charge. But in New York, they made it a separate felony offense when you strangle somebody, and has its own definition. The other thing that gets studied here is the victim's role. Did they play a role in the crime? Became a victim. And then they try and design programs and services for victims of crimes that hopefully, I don't use the word rehabilitates because that's for an offender, but it hopes to help them out as a victim, whether that is paying them back. That's a system we have here in New York. It's called Crimes Victim Fund, where defendants are actually required to pay into it. They're also, as part of their sentence, required to pay back anything that the victim is out in loss. And if they ultimately don't, it comes out of this Crimes Victim Fund. But if a victim suffered, psychological damage and was seeing a therapist, those costs would be on the defendant to pay for. All right, so here's a couple nice, easy charts of what we just gone through, the disciplines of criminology in a simpler form. They're also in the book, but it's nice to have I hope you're printing out the slides to have in hand as we go through. Helps you study. All right, let's run through the history of criminology. Where did it come from? It's actually a fairly more recent growing aspect of the criminal. I'm not putting it in the criminal justice lump, but it's area of study. Let's call it an area of study. The Middle Ages, we certainly didn't have anything like criminology, right? Those who committed crimes, the crimes were against, the social norms or the religious practices. If, you practice witchcraft, oh no, you are punished in some fashion because it goes against religious practices. And their penalties were really harsh. A lot of times it was in public: whipping, branding, maiming. You could get your hand chopped off for stealing, right? Execution. And that wasn't just for murder. They used torture to force confessions, whether, what they learned was true or not. Based on studies, it's, torturing somebody doesn't get you to the truth. People just want to be not tortured anymore. They'll say what you want them to say. So, forced confessions don't really get you to the truth. By the mid-18th century, philosophers, they call them philosophers, not criminologists, they argued for a different kind of approach where the punishment should be fit for the crime, should be fair. But it also should kind of deter offenders from engaging in criminal conduct. And there was a philosopher, Cesare Beccaria, and he theorized that people commit crimes for their own pleasure and reward. So his idea to curb this was that the punishment should be enough to deter the lure of criminal gain. Okay, you want to deter the lure of criminal gain. It can't be, if it's too lenient, the criminal won't take it seriously. If it's too harsh, criminals have nothing to lose. For instance, if they are going to get the death penalty, if they commit rape, then why not just kill the rape victim too? Because that will get you the death penalty. So, but it can't be too lenient where doing the crime is worth it to the punishment. So the punishment under Mr. Beccaria was to be effective. It had to be prompt. It had to be in the public. The public had to know about it. Necessary and proportionate. And it had to be stated in the law. If you did this, this is what's going to happen to you. You had to know what it was. And this actually becomes the backbone of our classical criminology perspective, which we're going to talk about a little later. The 9th century brought on a new perspective and brought a way of looking at causes of crime. And Auguste Comte, I think is how I say his name, it's in the book, Comte, the founder of sociology. He is known for the positivism criminology perspective. And under this view, it was more of a scientific method. Scientific methods are used to explain behavior. So they use scientific methods to conduct research that's objective, that's universal, and it's culture-free. It allows things to be explained in a logical manner. All statements, beliefs are backed by some investigation using scientific methods. Scientific methods, meaning this stuff about God and the soul are out. It has to be discussed in and investigated using scientific manner. And the science, importantly, is not to be influenced by bias or political view. So it's objective. Examples, there's a number of examples of this perspective in context. Scientists were explaining biological aspects of the human. It's on page 10 of the book, and I will leave that for your review. We're going to move on. I like to just keep these lectures because we're not in a classroom setting where I'd be asking you questions and we'd be interacting. This is more of a condensed overview with some extra examples to the book. It's not me reading the book to you. At least hopefully that's not how it feels. I just want to expand on things even though I know that these are in the book. So our next perspective was developed in the late 1800s, the sociological criminology. This science was used to study the major social changes happening in the 19th century in society. So this focused on studying society itself. Under this theory, they recognize that crime is normal part of society, because people are different. We never lived in a society ever where there was never any crime. And without real, quote unquote, real crime, human weaknesses would elevate to the stature of something that would be a crime. Like, for instance, and I love this example, this is actually in the book, and I like it, it's perfect. Socrates, he was a theorist, philosopher, right? He was considered a criminal because he was corrupting, at least that's what they said, he was, quote unquote, corrupting the morals of the youth because he expressed different ideas than what the majority of people believed. The folks who were punished for practicing witchcraft because it wasn't the norm. So under the study of society, there was three theories. The anomy, where one has a lack of norms or clear social standards. And what happens is it results in confusion and rebellion. So is it possible that the law, and this is a question posed in the book as well, if you think about what this theory is, where one has a lack of norms or clear social standards, they can result in them being confused, or they can rebel. So the question was, is it possible that the loss of privacy created by widespread social media has helped create a sense of anomy in our culture? I mean, this is a serious question we should think about, because this is where we're going through changes, and how is that going to affect society? We had privacy. I lived in a world where there was no social media. I grew up, I didn't have a cell phone. I actually only recently have a smartphone, the last 2-3 years when I say recently. But you can instantly, something private can become public in an instant, right? These days. So would that cause some sense of uprise, confusion, rebellion? Think about that one. The Chicago School. It's a concept under this perspective. They call it that because this perspective was developed at the University of Chicago. And it's the study of relationship between environmental conditions and crime. So poverty in urban areas, right? The result was that school and family life has an effect. Higher crime, there's a determined, or at least their perspective, that the higher crime rate there's a higher crime rate in areas of poverty, or where there's some social or family discord. In the early 1900s, there was research that was conducted that linked criminal behavior to one's socialization. And, the key was relationships have an important social process. They do. So they do in any aspect. And who you associate with is who influences you. So they were studying this concept. Children who are exposed by homes wrecked with conflict or subject to inadequate homes or associated with deviant peers, their perspective was that it was more likely that they would be involved in criminal behavior based on their study and their perspective. So the sociological criminology is studying the environment and the relationships between our environmental conditions and relationships. All right. Conflict theory. Karl Marx. He was convinced that the character of every civilization was determined by its mode of production. What does that mean? The key relationship to this system, according to Karl Marx, was the owner, who is also referred to as a capitalist bourgeoisie. And if you actually Google that name, it's going to give you the common definition, which means middle class. And those who do the work, the proletariat, that's the worker bee. That's the person who sells their labor. They're the social class. And according to Marx, because the economic system controls our lives, people's lives revolve around the means of production. Okay? Think capitalism. And so the exploitation of those laborers, those social class, also called the working class, they would lead to class conflict because the higher ups, the owners, made the production world go around. So ultimately, according to Karl Marx, this was the capitalist system. And the capitalist system creates the crime, or the conflict theory. The conflict theory is the conflict between the owners and the laborers. So, to sum up, the view that human behavior is shaped by interpersonal conflict and that crime is the product of human conflict. In the 1960s, in the U.S., with the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-establishment counterculture movement, like everything was happening in the 60s, criminologists began to analyze these conditions, these social conditions, along with the class conflict and crime. And what emerged was the critical criminology. And the overall view, kind of the combo of these two, or what stems from the conflict theory, is the view that crime is the product of the capitalism system. The developmental criminology, the Glücks, husband and wife team, the Glücks, this created this perspective, and it's based on the idea that criminal career was developed as a result of influence by internal and external situations, conditions, and circumstances. And this was integrated. What they did was they integrated a number of the previous perspectives, sociological, psychological, and economic elements, into a complex developmental view of crime. So they kind of took from the others and mixed them up and had done their own study of showing that, well, people's economic situations, their psychological aspects, and their sociological aspects all play a role, and that's our perspective. All right, which brings us to the contemporary criminology. This is what we're involved in. This is what's used now. One of these theories here. These will be fleshed out in greater detail through chapters 4 through 7. But these points of view, the ones that we just discussed, they've evolved over time. And they've been flushed out and are now set forth in one or more of the following theories. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot now, and then we will dive into those. Rational choice theory. It's very similar to the classical. This is where criminals choose to commit crimes. They weigh the benefits with the fear of punishment. If the punishment is too harsh, or the likelihood of them being caught, less likely they are going to choose crime. If the punishment is less than the risk of doing the crime, then they're going to do the crime. The rational choice theory. The trait theory, this is on the positivism aspect perspective. No one single trait explains crime. Rather, it's biological, psychological, and environmental factors that influence criminality. Our social structure theory. This is our person's place in social structure that controls the behavior. So this is the quote-unquote product of your environment. The bottom of the social hierarchy believes it's impossible to achieve success. So they basically experience the enemy, the failure, strain, stress, frustration, and because of all that, it leads them down the wrong path. We have our social process theory, the socialization, that children learn to commit crimes by modeling behavior after those that are in constant contact with or who they admire. The critical theory, the crime is related to the inherently unfair economic structure of the U.S., our Marx, similar to the Marx theory. And the developmental theory, which is the Gluck's process, and that focuses on identifying the personal traits and social conditions that lead to criminal careers. So all of these theories we're going to explore in more detail. And here is a brief summary for your notes, and we're going to move on to the second part of Chapter 1.